Dawn crept slowly over Glacier National Park, setting the tips of pine needles aglow and sending pale streaks of sunlight across the icy ground. The world here was waking up. Chickadees chattered above, and the wind smelled like clean water and cold stone. In a remote corner of the park, where few hikers bothered to wander in early spring, Liam Walker was already up, boots crunching over the brittle grass, clipboard in hand. He walked in silence, his breath steaming, every sense alert. This was his favorite time, before the crowds and chatter, when the wild still felt secret. His partner that morning, Casey Parker, was a few steps behind, muttering as she wrestled with the GPS unit. "Why do they always send us to the muddiest spots first?" she grumbled, pausing to wipe her glasses. Liam just smiled. He'd worked as a wildlife technician long enough to know that the best discoveries happened when you least expected or wanted them. "Tracks are freshest near the creek," Liam said, leading the way down a narrow game trail. The ground sloped steeply, and the rush of meltwater grew louder as they approached the water's edge. The air was sharper here, the ground pocked with prints. Deer, fox, something larger he couldn't quite place. He knelt down, running his fingers along a heavy paw mark pressed deep in the mud. "Looks like a bobcat's been through," he said, squinting at the shape. "Big one, too." He'd always admired these creatures, elusive, fierce ghosts of the forest. But today, the prints told a story of more than just passing through. They wobbled and dragged in places, as if their maker had been limping or staggering. Casey's voice cut through his thoughts. "Liam, look over there, by the water." She pointed, her hand trembling slightly. At first, he saw nothing but the rocks and the dark glimmer of the creek. Then, a shape resolved from the shadows, a large mottled bobcat, splayed out at the edge of the water, its fur slick with melting frost. Liam's first instinct was caution. Wild animals, especially injured ones, could be unpredictable. But as they crept closer, he noticed the animal wasn't moving, barely even breathing. Its flanks rose and fell so shallowly, he wondered if it was alive at all. Blood matted the fur along one side, and the bobcat's eyes, usually bright and wary, were glassy with exhaustion. "Stay back," Liam warned, though his own feet kept moving. The cat didn't so much as twitch, even as he knelt a few feet away. That's not normal, he thought. Even a dying wildcat would snarl, bolt, show teeth. But this one just stared, hollow and defeated, as if whatever had brought it here had already taken everything it had to give. Casey crouched beside him, voice low. "Should we call it in?" Or she trailed off, uncertainty in her eyes. Liam hesitated. He knew the rules. Don't interfere unless absolutely necessary. Don't risk yourself for an animal that might not make it anyway. But something about the way the bobcat just lay there, half in, half out of the creek, shivering but unwilling or unable to move, pricked at his conscience. Would you stop to help? Liam wondered aloud. If it meant putting yourself at risk for a wild animal no one expects you to trust? He was talking to himself as much as Casey. He radioed headquarters. "This is Walker, Unit 4. We've got an injured bobcat near Marker 17 East Creek Bank. Looks bad. Requesting veterinary support and backup for relocation. Possible hypothermia, maybe worse." "Copy, Walker. Rescue en route. Estimated 30 minutes, came the crackling reply. They sat in tense silence, the only sound the gurgle of the creek and the ragged breathing of the animal. As the sun rose higher, Liam studied the bobcat's injuries, a nasty gash along its ribs, one leg twisted at an odd angle. He thought about the nights he'd spent tracking these animals, marveling at their survival. He'd always believed nature was brutal but fair. The strong survived. The weak faded quietly. But looking at this cat, so battered, so beaten. He felt something shift. "Maybe he's just tired," Casey whispered. "Or maybe he's waiting for something." They didn't have to wait long. The rescue team arrived. Dr. Haley Maddox, the park's vet, leading the way with practiced calm. She approached slowly, speaking in a soft voice, tranquilizer dart ready, but not yet raised. "Easy, boy," she murmured, kneeling beside the Bobcat. "Let's get you safe." With practiced hands, she checked for vital signs, examined the wounds, then injected the sedative. The animal barely reacted. Liam saw a flicker of intelligence in its eyes, a moment of clarity. Then the big cat slumped fully, the last bit of tension draining from its frame. "We'll need to move him now," Dr. Maddox said, glancing at her team. "No sudden moves, and keep your voices down." As they gently slid a tarp beneath the Bobcat, Liam felt a strange chill. Something about the way the animal had let them near, the way it had lain there as if expecting help, unsettled him. This wasn't how wild stories usually went. He wondered what act of wild courage or desperate need had brought this predator to surrender at the feet of humans. He didn't know that the real story, the one that would change him, was just beginning. Sometimes, the line between bravery and sacrifice is drawn by a trembling paw on an icy bank, and a question no one wants to answer. How far would you go to protect a life that isn't your own? The air inside the rescue truck was thick with urgency and the sharp scent of antiseptic. Dr. Haley Maddox kept her focus, issuing instructions as her team gently lifted the sedated Bobcat onto a stretcher. Liam helped guide the tarp, careful not to jostle the animal's injured side. Even sedated, the Bobcat looked fierce and ancient, his fur ragged, body battered, but there was a gravity to him that drew everyone's attention. "Let's check for more wounds," Dr. Maddox said. She knelt, hands gentle but sure, pressing along the cat's flanks, searching for hidden injuries. As she rolled the Bobcat slightly to inspect his underbelly, a sudden gasp rippled through the group. "Wait, what's that?" Casey blurted, voice quivering. Liam bent closer, eyes wide. Underneath the huge cat's body, tucked so tightly against his chest they seemed fused to him, were two tiny bobcat kittens. Their fur was matted, their bodies shivering with cold. So small they looked more like bundles of wet leaves than living creatures. One was mewling softly, its voice thin and desperate. The other lay silent, limp as a rag doll. For a split second, no one moved. It was as if time had frozen, the entire rescue team staring in shock. Wild bobcats were solitary, especially males. Everyone knew the lore. Male bobcats didn't raise kittens, didn't guard them, and certainly didn't risk their lives to keep them alive. Yet here, right before them, was a scene that defied every expectation. Dr. Maddox's hands trembled only slightly as she reached in, cupping the kittens in her palms. "They're half frozen," she said, her voice both clinical and deeply moved. "Get the warming pads. We need to bring their temperatures up." Slowly. Liam felt his heart pounding. The bigger kitten, the one still mewling, tried to crawl back toward the male, its eyes squeezed shut, seeking warmth and comfort. The smaller one didn't move at all. Its sides barely fluttered with each shallow breath. The rescue team sprang into action. Casey raced for the emergency kit, pulling out tiny heat packs and soft towels. Liam knelt, letting the larger kitten press against his palm. Its fur was coarse, its bones impossibly fragile beneath the skin. He could feel the faint, frantic beat of its heart. Was he protecting them? Liam wondered out loud, his voice hoarse. All night, in this cold? Dr. Maddox nodded, eyes shining. He used his own body as a shield. She shook her head, unable to find the words. That's not something we expect to see. The team worked with careful precision. The kittens were wrapped in warm towels, tucked against heating pads, and monitored for signs of shock. Every few minutes, Dr. Maddox checked their vitals, murmuring encouragement like a mother would to frightened children. The male bobcat, now fully sedated, lay still, his breathing slow but steady. Casey couldn't stop staring. Why would a wild tomcat do this? Aren't they supposed to just walk away? No one had an answer. Liam felt a strange surge of anger. At the world, at nature, at the rules everyone said were unbreakable. He looked at the kittens, one fighting, one fading, and felt a gut punch of helplessness. The truck rattled over a rough patch of road, heading toward the wildlife center. The engine's hum was a backdrop to whispered conversations and the soft, pitiful mews of the surviving kitten. Every time the road bumped, the kitten shivered and whimpered, searching for the heat and heartbeat of the father that had protected it from the night's deadly chill. They arrived at the wildlife center just as the sun crested the mountains, painting the sky in bands of orange and blue. Inside, the lights were already on, staff members waiting. Dr. Maddox gave orders as soon as the doors swung open. ICU bay. We need fluids, warming incubators, glucose. Now, she barked. Liam followed, cradling the kittens as if they were made of glass. The larger one stirred weakly in his hands, its ears twitching. The smaller, still limp, showed no reaction even as the warmth surrounded it. The male bobcat, Shadow, the name came unbidden to Liam, was placed on a padded table, IVs threaded carefully into his leg. Blood was drawn, X-rays ordered. The rescue team moved like a well-oiled machine, but every eye flicked again and again to the kittens. As Dr. Maddox examined the kittens under the bright lamp, a hush fell over the room. She checked the weaker one first, listening to its chest with a tiny stethoscope, frowning at the sluggish pulse. He's not responding to heat. We might lose him, she said softly. No, Liam said, surprising himself with the sharpness in his voice. He made it this far. We can't let him go now. He bent lower, whispering encouragements, willing the tiny heart to keep beating. Casey hovered nearby, eyes wet. Maybe if the big one hears Shadow's heartbeat, it'll fight harder. It was a desperate idea, but Dr. Maddox nodded. They brought the kittens close to Shadow's side, tucking them against his thick fur, letting them feel the shallow, rhythmic thud of his heart. The stronger kitten snuggled in, trembling, while the weaker one remained still. Yet Liam swore he saw its paw twitch just once. Hours passed. The staff worked in tense silence. Every small sign of life from the kittens was met with hope and fear. Outside, the world went on. Birds sang, snow melted. The park rangers called in their morning reports. But in the quiet, clinical light of the wildlife center, a wild act of sacrifice had shifted the rules of nature. By midday, the bigger kitten's breathing had steadied. The smaller one, against all odds, let out a single, broken cry, a sound so frail and defiant that everyone froze. They're fighting, Dr. Maddox whispered. They want to live. Liam, shaken, looked from Shadow to the kittens. For the first time in his life, he questioned what he thought he knew about wildness, about parenthood, about the lines between love and instinct. In this single, shattering morning, a battered tomcat had turned nature's script upside down, sheltering his young with everything he had left. And the world, for just a moment, seemed bigger and wilder than before. The day slipped quietly into afternoon as clouds rolled over the peaks, painting the wildlife center's windows with shifting light. Inside, the hum of medical equipment and the careful shuffle of footsteps created an atmosphere both urgent and strangely peaceful. Liam found himself standing at the edge of the ICU bay, watching Shadow and the two kittens as Dr. Maddox's team moved in soft, efficient rhythms around them. The Bobcat, Shadow as everyone was calling him now, lay in his padded enclosure, hooked up to IV fluids and a heart monitor that blinked its slow, steady rhythm. He looked impossibly weary, his flanks bandaged, one leg immobilized, eyes barely open. Yet when the kittens, now nestled in a smaller, heated den beside him, mewled in their sleep, Shadow would shift just enough to look their way, as if reassuring himself they were still safe. Liam had seen a lot in his years as a wildlife technician, but nothing quite like this. He leaned against the glass, arms crossed tightly over his chest, a weight settling in his gut. Most male bobcats disappeared after mating, their role in the lives of their young over before it ever truly began. But Shadow had broken all the rules, not only by staying, but by putting his battered body between his kittens and the freezing night. A soft knock at the glass startled Liam out of his thoughts. Dr. Maddox slipped into the observation area, rubbing her temples, exhaustion in the lines of her face. "You okay?" she asked gently. "Yeah," Liam replied, but the word tasted hollow. "I just keep replaying it in my head. The way he wouldn't leave them. The way he protected them." Haley studied him for a moment, then sat beside him. "You know, we went through the old tracking logs. Shadow's been tagged before. We think he lost his mate last winter. There was a rock slide near Bearclaw Ridge. She disappeared not long after. The kittens are probably his own. Orphaned." Liam felt a sharp ache. So he's all they had left, and he knew it. Dr. Maddox nodded. "Bobcats aren't supposed to do this. The literature says males are solitary, even aggressive toward young. But Shadow," she looked through the glass, her expression softening. "He rewrote the book." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Through the window, the kittens curled together, pressed so close their stripes blurred. The larger one had perked up, eyes open, nose twitching at every new scent. The smaller, still weak, but breathing, seemed to draw comfort from its siblings' warmth, the two of them joined by trauma and the faint, wild hope of survival. Liam pressed his forehead to the glass, memories he hadn't visited in years flooding back. He'd grown up in a small Montana town, his mother raising him alone after his father left, a man more shadow than memory, someone who'd chosen absence over presence. All his life, Liam had watched animals move by instinct, by rules etched in their DNA, and told himself it was just nature's way, no room for sentiment, no room for grief. But now, looking at Shadow, this battered tomcat refusing to let go, something inside Liam shifted. Was it love that drove the old cat? Instinct? Or something messier and more complicated? A refusal to abandon no matter the cost? Dr. Maddox's voice broke the silence. "You ever wonder what drives a parent to risk everything for their kids?" Liam considered. "Yeah, more than I admit." She smiled, a little sad. "Shadow's story, his loss, his fight to protect, makes me question everything I thought I knew about wildness. Maybe love isn't just a human thing." They sat together for a while watching. Nurses came and went, checking monitors, refreshing IVs, jotting notes. The center's usual bustle felt muted, everyone moving more quietly than usual, as if reverence had settled over the place. Late that afternoon, after a shift change, Casey returned with a laptop and a stack of old field notes. She'd spent her break digging into the records, tracing Shadow's movements through a maze of GPS pings and scribbled observations. "Look at this," she said, scrolling through photos. "Last spring, a female bobcat, his mate, we think, showed up with kittens near Bearclaw Ridge. Then the rock slide hit, and her collar went offline. Shadow's tracker lit up right after, circling the same spot for weeks, like he was looking for her. Liam felt a lump form in his throat. He stayed. Yeah, Casey said softly. And when he found the kittens, his own orphans, he didn't leave them either. A long silence followed, heavy and full of things left unsaid. Through the glass, the kittens shifted, the bigger one licking its sibling's ear. Shadow's head lifted, his eyes dark and fathomless. Liam watched, mesmerized. For all the science, all the data, nothing explained what he was seeing now. A story of grief, devotion, and something like hope, told in the silent language of a family the world had never expected. Night crept over the mountains. The wildlife center grew quiet, staff moving softly through dim corridors. Liam stayed, watching as the kittens huddled together, still too traumatized to play, their tiny bodies pressed close for warmth and comfort. Sometimes they'd cry out in their sleep, startled by nightmares, only to settle when Shadow shifted near. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Inside, under the low hum of the heaters, Shadow and his kittens faced the long dark together, a wild, improbable family, defying every expectation. Liam lingered at the glass until Dr. Maddox nudged him gently. Go home, get some rest. We'll need you tomorrow. But as Liam left, he glanced back one last time. Shadow's eyes met his, and in that quiet, unwavering gaze, Liam saw a challenge. Protection wasn't just about strength or instinct. Sometimes it was a choice, an act of will, a refusal to give up even when the world said you should. And as the center lights dimmed, Liam carried that lesson with him, the weight of it both heavy and strangely healing. Sometimes, the wildest acts of love are the ones no one sees coming, and they change everything. The nights in Glacier National Park could feel endless, especially in early spring. At the Wildlife Center, the world shrank to pools of fluorescent light and the hush of worried voices. For Liam, the center had always been a place of business, a sterile zone of checklists, charts, and routine care. But as days passed after Shadow's rescue, something in the air shifted. The staff found themselves walking more softly, glancing into the enclosures with reverence usually reserved for places of worship. Shadow and his kittens were recovering, but progress was painfully slow. The big Bobcat was alert, but every movement cost him, his breaths shallow and uneven. Bandages circled his side and leg, hiding wounds that ran deeper than flesh. The kittens, still weak, had been placed in a heated den right beside Shadow's enclosure. At first, both refused food, pushing away bottles and dishes with trembling paws. They hardly made a sound, two little ghosts haunted by memories they couldn't understand. Liam and Dr. Maddox kept vigil. Day after day, they tried everything: syringe-feeding formula, tucking the kittens into warm blankets, even placing a ticking clock nearby to mimic a heartbeat. Nothing worked. The kittens only perked up when Shadow was close. When they could see or hear him, they'd inch toward the glass divider, pressing their noses against it, mewling quietly for a comfort just out of reach. When Shadow, fighting pain and sedation, managed to shift closer, the kittens would quiet and lie down, eyes on their father, as if tethered by invisible threads. It's not just instinct, Dr. Maddox said one evening, exhaustion weighing on her words. She slumped on a chair beside Liam, their dinner untouched on the break room table. We always say animals are ruled by instinct, but this is something deeper. Liam ran a hand through his hair, staring at the security monitor that streamed footage of Shadow and the kittens. Maybe it's love, he said, voice almost lost in the hum of the machines. or whatever passes for love in the wild. Dr. Maddox considered this, then smiled sadly. That's the kind of thing you'd get laughed at for saying at a science conference. She sipped her coffee. But I've seen mother wolves risk everything for a pup, and once, years ago, a male coyote brought food to a litter that wasn't even his. Sometimes nature doesn't care about the rules we write. One night, a decision was made. The kittens were still declining, refusing food and growing dangerously weak. After hours of debate and reviewing every possible risk, Dr. Maddox persuaded the staff to try something unprecedented: a supervised reunion. The plan was simple: place the kittens in Shadow's enclosure, with staff ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Under the low light of the ICU, with tension coiling in the air, Liam gently carried the kittens to Shadow's side. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Shadow stirred. His eyes widened. Despite his pain, he reached out with a trembling paw and drew both kittens close. The kittens responded instantly, crawling over his fur, burrowing beneath his chin, kneading his chest with desperate little paws. Shadow made a sound, a deep, rumbling purr that vibrated through the enclosure. It was a sound none of the staff had ever heard from a wild bobcat before. The kittens latched onto him, pressing close, their tiny bodies finally relaxing. The room was silent except for that purr. Liam felt tears prick his eyes, and even the more hardened staffers turned away, pretending to check supplies or jot notes. It was the purest, most raw moment of connection he'd ever witnessed. A family, broken but not defeated, drawing strength from each other in their shared grief. For the next few hours, the kittens fed hungrily, nuzzling against Shadow's side. Whenever one whimpered, Shadow curled tighter around them, his massive paw covering them protectively. The staff watched in awe. Science had no protocol for this. A grieving father, 2 traumatized kittens, and a bond so powerful it silenced every doubt about animal emotion. Liam stayed long after the others left, sitting on a stool outside the glass. He couldn't look away. The image of Shadow and his kittens etched itself into his mind, a symbol of devotion that went beyond species or survival. He thought about his own childhood, the years of longing for a father who never returned, and felt a mixture of pain and hope. When Dr. Maddox returned, she found Liam still watching. She leaned against the doorframe. "You ever wish you could go back and rewrite your own story?" she asked, her voice gentle. Liam glanced at her, then back at the sleeping bobcats. "All the time. But maybe we don't have to. Maybe we just learn from stories like this. Maybe we get to be better." Dr. Maddox nodded, her eyes wet. "Yeah, maybe we do." The days blurred together. The kittens' health improved steadily, but they still refused food unless Shadow was near. Staff rotated shifts, but Liam stayed late almost every night. He was driven by something he couldn't name, a desire to witness, to honor, to be present for this rare, wild love. One evening, just after midnight, a nurse called him to the ICU. The kittens were restless, crying out, pawing at the glass. Shadow, weak and feverish, struggled to lift his head. Liam entered the enclosure, his presence quiet and calm. As he settled onto the floor, the kittens crawled into his lap. Shadow, seeing his young safe, let out a sigh so deep and sorrowful it sounded almost human. Liam stroked the kittens gently. He knew that science might never explain what was happening here, why a wild animal would risk everything for love, why loss could bind a family so fiercely. But in that quiet moment, beneath the dim hospital lights, he understood something fundamental. Compassion wasn't just a human trait. It lived in the wild, too, in every creature that refused to give up on those it loved. And as dawn crept over the snowy mountains, Liam made a silent promise. He would fight for this family, for their chance at healing, for the lesson they'd given him, a lesson about the strength it takes to protect and the courage it takes to mourn. Morning came with a brittle kind of light, streaking the windows of the Wildlife Center and turning the snow beyond them the color of faded pewter. Inside, a new tension gripped the ICU. Shadow's condition had worsened overnight. Where once he'd struggled to his feet to nuzzle his kittens, now he lay nearly motionless, flanks heaving with each labored breath. Even the rhythmic thump of his heart monitor seemed to slow, pulsing out a warning everyone in the center could feel. Liam arrived before sunrise, his mind already bracing for the possibility he'd been dreading. As he slipped through the hall, he found Casey and Dr. Maddox huddled around the main monitor, their faces drawn tight. "He's holding on," Casey said softly, her words heavy with uncertainty. "But I don't know for how much longer." Inside the enclosure, the kittens had changed. After their reunion with Shadow, the spark in them had slowly returned. They played with each other in fits and starts, tumbling over the blankets and gnawing on each other's ears. But now, sensing the heavy air, they huddled quietly by Shadow's side, their little bodies pressed against his battered frame, their eyes watchful and anxious. The team kept a constant vigil, Chasayans were adjusted, fluids checked, vitals monitored every hour. But the truth was obvious. Shadow was running out of time. His wounds, so bravely endured in the wild, had finally caught up with him. Every breath came harder than the last, and every movement was a monumental effort. Despite the pain, Shadow refused to turn away from his kittens. When one cried out in the night, he'd try to rise, pushing himself up just enough to nuzzle them, his purr a ragged, rumbling reassurance. Liam, watching from behind the glass, felt the ache as if it was his own. The staff rotated through their shifts, but he found himself returning again and again, unable to break free from the gravity of the scene before him. Dr. Maddox pulled Liam aside late that afternoon. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted, voice low, eyes red from too many sleepless nights. "He's not fighting for himself anymore. He's fighting for them. It's like he's holding on by will alone, just until he knows they'll be okay." Liam nodded. He's their whole world. If they lose him, they'll be lost all over again. As dusk crept in, the staff gathered for a meeting in the quiet break room. The consensus was grim. Shadow's body was shutting down. Painkillers eased his suffering, but nothing could mend the internal damage. Some argued it was time to let nature take its course. Others wanted to try another round of treatment, refusing to accept what everyone sensed was inevitable. Liam spoke up, surprising even himself. "We owe him a peaceful ending. He protected them when no one else could. Let's make sure his last hours are spent with them." The decision was made. That night, the kittens would remain in Shadow's enclosure, safe within his reach. Extra bedding was added, and the temperature raised to keep everyone warm. Dr. Maddox stayed close, monitoring both father and kittens for any sign of distress. As the night deepened, a hush fell over the ICU. The world outside faded into darkness, snow falling silently against the glass. Inside, Shadow's breathing grew more labored, but whenever the kittens stirred or whimpered, he summoned the strength to curl around them, drawing them closer with the last of his energy. Liam couldn't leave. He settled onto a chair outside the enclosure, notebook forgotten in his lap. He watched the slow, quiet drama play out. Two young lives clinging to their protector, and a father who refused to let go, no matter how much it cost him. Somewhere in the early hours, the larger kitten woke and began to play, batting at Shadow's twitching tail. The smaller one followed, chasing shadows across the enclosure, mewling softly for attention. Shadow, barely able to lift his head, watched them with heavy, loving eyes. The staff, watching on the monitors, exchanged glances. Hope flickered, however faintly. But even as the kittens played, a new understanding settled in. Shadow was only holding on for them. Every moment was a battle, every breath a gift. The staff knew this was the last vigil. Grief hovered in the air, thick and inescapable. At one point, Casey joined Liam outside the glass. "You ever seen a wild animal do this?" she whispered. Liam shook his head. "Never. I thought I understood what nature was about. But this is something else." Casey nodded, tears threatening. "Makes you want to be braver, doesn't it? To care that much, even when you're hurting." Liam swallowed hard. He thought of his own father again, how absence left a silence nothing could fill. Shadow, in these final hours, had given his kittens something irreplaceable. Not just survival, but love, shown in every stubborn act of care. The night dragged on, each hour marked by 1,000 silent promises. Liam kept his vigil. He remembered stories from his childhood, tales of animal heroics and loyal companions, but nothing compared to this. Nothing so raw, so real. Toward dawn, Shadow tried to rise one last time. His body trembled, breath hitching, but he pressed his nose to each kitten, purring weakly. The kittens pressed closer, eyes wide with worry, as if sensing what was to come. Liam reached out, pressing his hand gently to the glass. "You did enough," he whispered. "You gave them everything." The first hints of sunrise crept over the mountains. Inside the enclosure, father and kittens huddled together, a portrait of devotion and sacrifice. The staff, gathered silently, understood what was happening. They braced for the inevitable, their hearts heavy with gratitude and sorrow. Shadow's vigil was nearly over. And for Liam, for everyone who'd watched this wild act of love, nothing would ever be the same. The world outside the Wildlife Center was silent, blanketed in the blue hush of pre-dawn. Inside, under the soft glow of the ICU lights, the room felt sacred, as if time itself was holding its breath. Shadow lay curled in his enclosure, the two kittens tucked close, each heartbeat and breath measured, fragile, precious. The air vibrated with anticipation and dread. Liam arrived long before his shift, unable to sleep, drawn as if by an invisible thread. The previous night's vigil had left him exhausted, yet something deeper, an aching respect, a need to witness, pulled him through the doors before sunrise. He found Dr. Maddox already there, seated quietly on the floor beside Shadow's enclosure, her knees hugged to her chest. "They barely slept," she whispered, glancing up as Liam approached. Every time Shadow moved, the kittens woke and crawled to him. He wouldn't let them out of reach. Liam nodded, his eyes stinging. He pressed a hand to the glass, watching as Shadow blinked slowly, his gaze meeting Liam's with a wisdom both wild and ancient. The kittens were restless, clambering over their father's side, licking his ear, pawing at his twitching tail. For a moment, it was almost like a normal family scene, simple, playful, unremarkable. But beneath the surface, everyone knew this was goodbye. The staff had agreed. There would be no further interventions, no more rounds of invasive treatment. Shadow deserved peace. The only thing left to give was dignity, the comfort of his young beside him, and the gift of one last night wrapped around those he loved most. As dawn pressed closer, Liam, Dr. Maddox, and a few night shift nurses watched in reverent silence. The kittens, after their last feeding, curled into Shadow's side, one on either flank. Shadow, despite his pain, gently groomed each one in turn, his tongue rasping softly over their matted fur. The smaller kitten, now stronger but still the most vulnerable, tucked its head beneath Shadow's chin, letting out a tiny, uncertain purr. In that quiet moment, Shadow began to purr too, a low, melodic rumble that filled the enclosure and bled out into the sterile room beyond. It was a lullaby, ancient and wild, woven from instinct and sorrow and an impossible devotion. Liam closed his eyes, letting the sound settle deep inside his chest. It was the purest expression of love he'd ever witnessed, wordless, fierce, defiant against the darkness encroaching from all sides. Hours seemed to pass in a haze of stillness and subtle movement. Nurses changed IV fluids, checked vitals, but did so with the utmost care, unwilling to disrupt the sanctuary Shadow had created with his last reserves of strength. No one spoke above a whisper. It was as if the very walls knew what was unfolding. As the sky outside grew pale with the first hint of sunrise, Shadow's breathing became shallow, the spaces between each inhale longer, each exhale softer. The kittens, sensing something they could not understand but would never forget, clung closer, burrowing beneath their father's heavy paw. Liam wiped at his eyes, struggling with memories he'd buried long ago. The empty seat at his childhood dinner table, the phone calls that never came, the echo of footsteps that had vanished down a hallway and never returned. In this wildcat sacrifice, he found a reflection of everything he'd missed and everything he still hoped for: the courage to stay, to protect, to love even as the world demanded surrender. Dr. Maddox knelt beside the glass, tears tracing her cheeks. "He's waiting for them to sleep," she murmured. "He wants to make sure they're safe before he lets go." The staff dimmed the lights, casting the room in the gentle gold of morning. The kittens, lulled by their father's warmth and purring, finally settled. The larger one lay draped across Shadow's shoulder, while the smaller pressed against his chest, listening to the slow, fading heartbeat beneath its ear. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the window, Shadow lifted his head one final time. He looked at each kitten, then at the humans who'd come to care, to witness, to grieve. There was no fear in his eyes, only a deep, wild peace. He rested his head on his paws, curled tighter around his young, and with a long, contented sigh, slipped quietly from this world. The kittens slept on, unaware, cradled in the curve of their father's body, safe in the haven he'd created. The staff bowed their heads, some weeping openly, others silent in awe. Liam pressed his palm to the glass, lips trembling. "Thank you, old boy," he whispered. "You showed us what love means." Time passed strangely at the aftermath. No one rushed to separate the kittens from Shadow's side. The staff let them rest, honoring the final act of a life defined not by violence or instinct alone, but by a willful, defiant tenderness. When the kittens finally stirred, blinking into the soft morning, they found Shadow still and silent, his fur warm from their closeness. The larger kitten nudged him, confused, then curled beside him again, refusing to believe he could be gone. The smaller one let out a plaintive mewl, a note of loss that seemed to echo in every corner of the room. Dr. Maddox entered the enclosure with quiet respect, lifting each kitten gently, holding them close as they whimpered in protest. The staff prepared Shadow for a dignified farewell, placing a soft blanket over him, arranging flowers gathered from the park at his side. Liam stayed, watching the kittens through the glass as they searched for their father, crying softly, finally curling up together in a trembling ball of fur and longing. The center felt different now, as if a chapter had closed, a space carved out for memory, for mourning, for gratitude. Shadow's final act was not merely one of survival or even sacrifice. It was a lesson written in every heartbeat, every breath, every silent promise to never abandon those who need you. His legacy lingered in the warmth of his kittens, in the tears of those who'd cared, in the hearts of strangers who would soon hear his story. As the sun rose fully, spilling gold across the snowy landscape, Liam knew that some losses carve wounds that never truly heal. But they also leave gifts, echoes of courage, of guardianship, of a love wild enough to change everything it touches. And in the quiet that followed, the world felt just a little less cold. For days after Shadow's passing, the Wildlife Center felt heavier. The ICU, once filled with the constant rhythm of monitors and the staff's gentle encouragement, now seemed to echo with silence. It was a hush that settled over everyone, a quiet made sharper by the absence of the big Bobcat's steady breathing, and the knowledge that the kittens were, once again, orphans. Liam noticed the change most acutely in the kittens. Without Shadow's presence, they became listless, their playfulness fading as if someone had doused the last sparks of their hope. The larger kitten, usually the first to tumble and explore, pressed itself into the farthest corner of the enclosure, its wide amber eyes fixed on the spot where Shadow's scent still lingered. The smaller one, never quite as robust, barely ate, huddling against its sibling for warmth and comfort. Sometimes, together, they would let out soft, searching cries, pleas for a parent who could no longer answer. The staff did their best to support the kittens through this second loss. Dr. Maddox designed a careful routine, gentle feedings, lots of quiet time, minimal handling. Volunteers knitted soft blankets to mimic the feeling of fur. A speaker played recordings of purring and heartbeats. Still, the little bobcats clung to each other, refusing all but the most basic contact with humans or food. It was as if, in their grief, they were determined to shut out the world. Liam found himself drawn to their enclosure each night after closing, sitting just outside the glass and watching them with a mixture of sorrow and helplessness. The kitten's mourning haunted him, an echo of his own childhood memories, of empty rooms and long silences after his father left. He saw in their eyes the same stubborn, wounded longing he'd carried for years, and it pulled at something deep within him. He was not the only one affected. News of Shadow's story and his extraordinary sacrifice spread quickly throughout the park community and beyond. Staff members who had never worked directly with the Bobcats found themselves drifting past the ICU window, pausing to offer a silent nod or a whispered word of comfort. Visitors, hearing fragments of the tale from rangers and volunteers, left messages of condolence on the center's social media pages. Within a week, a wave of letters and donations began arriving. Children mailed hand-drawn cards of bobcats and kittens, scrawling "Thank you, Shadow" in bright crayon letters. A local artist offered to create a small stone memorial for the enclosure, a tribute to Shadow's guardianship. And a school from the nearest town sent a book of poems and reflections, each page marked with the question that now seemed to linger in every room. What does it mean to protect someone, even when it hurts? Despite the outpouring of support, the mood among the staff was bittersweet. Dr. Maddox organized a meeting to discuss the kitten's future, and for the first time her confidence faltered. "They're grieving," she admitted, voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Animals feel loss, sometimes as deeply as we do. I don't know if they'll recover enough to survive on their own." A hush followed her words. Some staff argued for a permanent sanctuary solution, keeping the kittens safe but captive. Others wanted to keep hope alive for a possible release, believing that with enough time and care, the little bobcats might heal and return to the wild, as Shadow surely would have wanted. It was Liam who spoke up, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "We owe it to Shadow to try. He didn't give up on them. We shouldn't either. Let's keep working. Give them a chance to choose their own path." That night, the staff built a small stone mound in the kitten's enclosure, using rocks from the same creek where Shadow had been found. They laid a scrap of Shadow's old blanket atop it, tucking in wildflowers and a few tufts of his fur, a silent tribute to the guardian who had shaped their fate. Liam watched as the kittens approached the mound, sniffing cautiously, circling it again and again. The smaller one sat and stared for a long time, as if listening for a memory only it could hear. Grief, the staff learned, was not something the kittens could be hurried through. Days stretched on, marked by small, painstaking victories and setbacks. Sometimes one kitten would eat a few bites or chase a fluttering leaf in the enclosure, only to retreat again into the shadows. Other days, both would huddle for hours, their little bodies shaking with the weight of absence. Through it all, Liam refused to give up hope. He began reading to the kittens from the other side of the glass, his voice soft and steady. Stories of the wild, of brave animals and impossible comebacks. He sang to them too, old lullabies his mother once used when his own heart felt too heavy for sleep. He knew it sounded foolish, but in the hush of the enclosure, it felt right. As spring deepened outside, signs of change slowly emerged. The kittens' eyes began to brighten, if only in fleeting moments. Occasionally, they would play, tentatively batting at each other's tails or wrestling for a scrap of blanket. And always, they returned to the stone mound, pressing their noses to the rocks, sitting together as the sun went down, a ritual that became both mourning and healing. Community support never faded. More letters arrived, and the artist finished a beautiful plaque for Shadow's memorial. For Shadow, who taught us what it means to protect, and how courage echoes long after we're gone. One morning, as the staff gathered for a routine health check, Liam noticed the smaller kitten nibbling at its food without coaxing. The larger one soon followed, and for the first time since Shadow's death, both cleaned their bowls and stretched out in the sun, purring faintly. A fragile hope returned to the center that day. The grief remained, a shadow over every victory, but so did the lesson Shadow had given them all. That even when loss feels too heavy to bear, love lingers. It shapes us, carries us, and sometimes helps us find our way back to life. Spring arrived in earnest at Glacier National Park, brushing the world in soft green and dappled gold. Outside the Wildlife Center, the air turned warmer, and the snow melted away from the trees, revealing carpets of moss and the first splashes of wildflowers. Inside, something was changing too, a gentle, almost imperceptible shift from grief to resilience. It began with small, precious moments in the kitten's enclosure, but soon hope threaded its way through every part of the center. The kittens, once so silent and still, began to stir with new energy. It started one evening when Liam came to check on them after closing. He found the larger kitten standing atop the stone mound, tail high, eyes bright with curiosity. The smaller one circled the base, pouncing at a loose feather Liam had tucked among the rocks. For the first time in weeks, the room rang with the sound of playful mews, a music so sweet and fragile, Liam had to wipe tears from his eyes before he stepped inside. He called Dr. Maddox, and together they watched, hearts pounding, as the kittens wrestled and chased each other. tumbling across the blankets in a blur of spots and stripes. The staff gathered at the window, whispering in amazement, afraid even a sudden breath might break the spell. "It's like they're remembering how to be wild," Casey murmured, her voice trembling with hope. The kitten's recovery picked up speed after that night. They ate more eagerly, their coats grew glossier, and the light returned to their eyes. The stone mound became the heart of their little world, a place for naps in the sun, for games of hide and seek, and sometimes for silent moments of remembrance. Every dusk, like clockwork, the kittens would curl together atop the stones, their eyes fixed on the changing light outside the window. The staff, heartened by the transformation, began to plan for the future. Liam and Dr. Maddox designed a soft release program, a gentle, staged process to prepare the kittens for life in the wild. The first step was expanding their enclosure, filling it with branches, logs, rocks, and live prey. The kittens needed to relearn the old instincts: how to stalk, how to hide, how to trust their senses. The team worked tirelessly, building challenges and puzzles, hiding food, scattering scents from the forest beyond. Liam watched every training session with a mix of anxiety and pride. The kittens learned quickly. The larger one was bold and athletic, pouncing on mice and climbing logs with natural grace. The smaller kitten, still shy but growing in confidence, was clever and cautious, often figuring out new puzzles before its sibling. Together, they made an unbreakable team, never straying far from one another, always returning to their stone memorial as dusk fell. As the days grew longer and the forest outside the center teemed with life, the staff opened a small, screened tunnel that led from the enclosure to a safe, protected yard, a taste of true wildness. The first time the kittens explored it, they hesitated, pausing at the threshold as if seeking Shadow's silent permission. Then, side by side, they stepped out, eyes wide with wonder, ears flicking at every new sound. Liam and Dr. Maddox watched from a distance, holding their breath. The kittens moved together as if tethered by invisible thread, never out of sight of each other, always returning to the familiar shelter at the end of every exploration. They sniffed the air, rolled in the grass, chased bugs, and pounced at shadows, gaining confidence with each passing day. The local community, invested in the kitten's journey, sent more donations and messages of encouragement. Children's drawings of the bobcats filled the staff room. The artist who had built the stone mound added a new plaque at its base: "Courage is wild, and love does not end. Shadow's gift lives on in every heart that dares to hope." Every evening, just before the staff left for the night, Liam would visit the enclosure and sit quietly by the glass. Sometimes he read aloud, sometimes he simply watched as the kittens, now nearly grown, settled at the top of the stone mound to watch the sun slip behind the trees. He imagined Shadow's spirit somewhere nearby, watching his children find their feet in a world that had once seemed impossibly cold. It was Casey who first noticed the kitten's ritual. "Look at them," she whispered one evening as the sky burned orange and purple. "They always come back to the memorial at dusk. It's like they're paying their respects. Or maybe they just remember." Dr. Maddox smiled. "Animals grieve, but they heal too. And sometimes, if we're lucky, they show us how." As the weeks turned into months, the kittens became almost unrecognizable. Lean, quick, bright-eyed, with muscles taut beneath their coats. The staff knew the time was approaching for the next, most difficult step: releasing them back into the wild. Liam struggled with the prospect of letting them go. He'd come to care for them deeply, not just as a caretaker, but as a witness to their journey through loss and survival. He worried about their safety, about whether Shadow's lessons would be enough to guide them in a world filled with risk and beauty. But every time he watched them slip through the tunnel, returning confidently to the stone mound as darkness fell, he felt a quiet assurance. Shadow's courage was alive in them, in the way they leaned on each other, faced the unknown, and refused to let grief define the rest of their story. The soft release was set for a late summer morning. Until then, every evening was a celebration of progress and a gentle goodbye. Liam never missed a dusk at the memorial, his heart full of gratitude. For Shadow, for the kittens, for the wild and unbroken hope that life, even after loss, could still surprise them all. When summer came to Glacier National Park, the whole landscape seemed to hold its breath, as if the forest itself was pausing to listen to a story that was not quite finished. The two young bobcats, once half-frozen bundles of loss, were now almost fully grown. Their coats gleamed in the sun, marked by the same wild patterns as Shadow, and their bodies moved with a quiet confidence born from hard-earned resilience. But even as the natural world hummed with life, the humans at the Wildlife Center found themselves changed in ways they had never expected. Liam felt the transformation most deeply. He had spent months caring for Shadow and the kittens, watching grief and hope take shape in fur and bone. But it was only as the time for the soft release drew near that he realized just how much he, too, had been shaped by the experience. It was more than pride, though he felt plenty of that, watching the kittens leap and play in the protected wild yard. It was a sense of humility, a dawning awareness that love and sacrifice didn't just belong to humans. The center decided to mark the kittens' transition with a small community event. Word had spread far beyond the park's borders. News outlets shared Shadow's story, how an old tomcat had shielded his orphaned young from the ice and refused to leave them, breaking every rule of his species. Families arrived with children who had drawn crayon tributes. Wildlife supporters came with donations, and park rangers recounted stories of animals and humans who had made the choice to protect, even at a cost. On the day of the event, Liam was asked to speak. He stood in front of a crowd that filled the center's small amphitheater, his hands trembling slightly as he gazed out at the expectant faces. The kittens, now so much stronger, watched from a shaded enclosure at the side, their eyes alert but calm. At the heart of the space, the artist's memorial to Shadow gleamed in the sunlight, a mound of stone and wildflowers, its plaque etched with words of courage and memory. Liam cleared his throat and began. When I first found Shadow by the creek, I thought I understood what it meant to be wild. I thought nature was just survival. The strong live, the weak are left behind. But Shadow showed us something different. He showed us that courage isn't just about strength, but about sacrifice. That real love sometimes means putting someone else before yourself, even when you don't have to. He paused, searching the faces in the crowd, seeing in them the same wonder that had filled him during those long nights in the ICU. I grew up thinking animals lived only by instinct. I told myself they didn't feel what we feel, didn't mourn, didn't choose. But Shadow broke that rule. He lost his mate, but he didn't abandon his young. He protected them, using his body as a shield against the cold. He held on through pain and fear, and in his last hours, he chose to give comfort instead of taking it. That's a kind of bravery I think we all can learn from. The audience was silent, moved. A little girl near the front raised her hand. "Did the kittens remember him?" she asked softly. Liam smiled, his voice gentle. "I think they do. Every night they visit his memorial, sitting there together as the sun goes down. It's their way of saying thank you, and maybe of holding on to a piece of him, just a little longer." After Liam spoke, Dr. Maddox addressed the crowd, highlighting the new humane policies inspired by Shadow's legacy. The center had started a rescue fund in his name, helping animals in dire situations who might once have been left to fate. More staff were being trained in trauma-informed care for wildlife, and park policies were shifting, acknowledging the complex emotional lives of animals. The story of Shadow's gift rippled outward, changing more than just procedures. It altered the way people saw the wild world beyond the park's borders. Letters arrived from across the country, some from children, others from people who'd lost loved ones or survived hardship, each finding hope in the old Bobcat's sacrifice. They spoke of how one act of wild compassion had reminded them to hold on, to fight for those they cared for, to see the wild as a place not just of danger, but of possibility. For Liam, the lesson was more personal. In the quiet after the event, as the sun set and the crowd dispersed, he found himself sitting by Shadow's memorial. The kittens were there, circling the stones, rubbing their cheeks against the cool granite. He remembered his own childhood, the sense of being unprotected, unseen. He realized that the love Shadow gave his kittens was the very thing he'd once longed for himself. Dr. Maddox sat beside him, silent for a while. Then she said, "It's not just animals that need protecting, is it? We all do in our own way." Liam nodded. "Sometimes we protect each other by just being there, by not giving up." She squeezed his shoulder. "Shadow's legacy isn't just for the wild. It's for all of us." As dusk settled over the park, a new understanding filled the center. Shadow's sacrifice had become a bridge, a reminder that the lines dividing human and animal, wildness and compassion, were never as solid as they seemed. The world, Liam realized, was made of small acts of bravery, of choosing to care even when it hurts, of remembering and honoring those who taught us to love with our whole hearts. Later, when the staff locked up for the night, the kittens returned to the stone mound one last time, side by side in the fading light. They sat together, silent sentinels, as if listening to the story the wild was still trying to tell. Sometimes, Liam thought, the wild teaches us the hardest lessons, about mercy, about grief, about a love that defies instinct and expectation. And sometimes, if we're willing to listen, those lessons can change us in ways we never imagined. When the morning of the release finally arrived, Glacier National Park felt impossibly alive. The air was bright and clean, scented with pine and dew. Every surface shimmered with possibility, as if the world itself was holding out its hands to welcome two new wild souls back where they belonged. For the staff at the Wildlife Center, especially Liam, the day carried a mix of joy, anxiety, and the bittersweet ache that comes with letting go. The young bobcats were ready, their fur shone with health, their bodies lean and powerful. They prowled the length of their enclosure with restless energy, never far apart. Over the last weeks, the soft release process had prepared them for freedom. They'd learned to hunt live prey, to climb and hide and stalk, to trust their senses instead of the hands that had nursed them through the hardest months of their lives. Most of all, they had each other, a bond forged in loss, tempered by the fierce protection of a father who had given everything. The staff gathered quietly at dawn. Dr. Maddox double-checked the last details: tracking collars, emergency supplies, transport crates lined with Shadow's old blanket. Liam watched the kittens from across the room, his hand pressed to the glass one final time. He remembered the first morning, finding Shadow by the creek, battered but refusing to abandon his young. The arc of those months felt enormous now, a story that had changed more than just two little lives. As the transport truck wound its way through the forest roads, Liam sat in back, The kittens nestled together in a large crate. The drive was silent except for the thrum of tires and the steady, anxious purr of the larger Bobcat. The smaller one pressed its nose to the mesh, eyes wide and unblinking as the world streamed past. Liam spoke softly, promising them what every parent hopes for their children. You're not alone. The wild is waiting for you. You have everything you need. They reached the release site, a private stretch of protected forest, thick with cover, running water, and abundant prey. The spot had been chosen with care and it felt right. The sun was just beginning to crest the trees, painting the moss and rocks in gold. Staff members moved quietly, setting up cameras and checking the perimeter for safety. Liam crouched by the crate, heart pounding. The staff opened the door, and for a moment, nothing happened. The kittens sniffed the air, their muscles taut. Then, as if remembering a lesson written deep in their bones, they stepped out together, hesitant at first, then bold, disappearing into the tangle of ferns and dappled light. For a few seconds, Liam caught glimpses of their striped bodies weaving between the shadows. Then they were gone. The world held its breath. The staff stood in silence, no one daring to break the spell. Then Dr. Maddox, tears in her eyes, placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. We did everything we could. Shadow would be proud. Later that day, after returning to the center, the staff gathered for a small ceremony by Shadow's memorial. The stone mound stood in the sun, surrounded by wildflowers and the mementos left by children, visitors, and volunteers. The new plaque caught the morning light, its message etched deep. What you choose to protect, whether person, wild animal, or memory, may change a life forever. Sometimes, the greatest acts of courage go unseen, but their echoes last for generations. Liam knelt by the mound, remembering every moment of the journey. Shadow's battered body shielding his kittens, the sound of their cries after he was gone, the hard-won victories and the quiet heartbreaks. He thought of the wild as something harsh and unforgiving, but now he saw it differently, a place of second chances, of surprising tenderness, of echoes that stretched further than anyone could see. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sanctuary, something remarkable happened. At the edge of the preserve, just beyond the tree line, two small shapes appeared. The kittens, wild and free, stood side by side, their bodies outlined in the gold of the dying light. For a long moment they paused, looking back toward the center, toward the place where their lives had changed. Liam watched, hardly breathing. He thought of all the people and animals who'd come through this place, carrying wounds and hope in equal measure. He understood, at last, what Shadow's gift really was. It wasn't just the protection of his own young, but the legacy of compassion he left behind. How one act of wild courage could ripple outward, changing every life it touched. Dr. Maddox joined him, her gaze soft. "They remember," she whispered. "They always will." As darkness fell, the kittens turned and vanished into the trees, leaving only their footprints in the soft earth. The stone mound glowed in the last light, a silent promise that love, true, wild, hard-won love, could survive even the harshest winters. Liam stood for a long time after everyone else had gone. He thought about his own life, the spaces left by loss, the people he'd tried to protect, the times he'd failed, and the times he'd succeeded. He understood now that courage wasn't about conquering the wild, but about honoring it, about choosing to be present, to care, even when the world made it difficult. The staff returned to their routines, but the story of Shadow and his kittens lingered. New arrivals came, each with their own wounds and hopes. And always, in the quiet moments, someone would find their way to the stone mound, leaving a pebble or a note, a tribute to the old bobcat who had taught them all what it meant to protect. At dusk, when the last light faded, Liam often walked to the edge of the preserve. Sometimes he glimpsed the two young bobcats, always together, moving silently through the wild as dusk deepened. They belonged to the world now, but they carried with them the lessons of Shadow's sacrifice, a legacy of devotion, courage, and love that would echo through generations. And so, as the darkness settled and the wild reclaimed its quiet, Liam knew that Shadow's gift was more than survival. It was hope. It was the promise that even the smallest act of protection could change a life, could shape the future, could linger long after the world had forgotten the details. At the end of it all, two bobcats paused one last time at the edge of the wild, looked back with shining eyes, and disappeared into the trees, carrying with them the echo of protection and the wild, enduring love of their father.